Harvard School of Public Health Professor Richard Levins. Charles Dickens wrote a novel called Hard Times, and surely we're living in hard times. I was wondering if you could discuss the challenges that face radicals in these hard times.
Well, there's been a history of about 150 years of radical struggle that built up the labor movement, built up socialist parties in many countries, that came to power in a number of revolutions. And it seemed as if the trajectory for radicals was to go through one struggle after another, but generally in an upward direction, leading toward a better world, leading toward the elimination of capitalism. This first 100 years, 150-year struggle has in many ways been defeated. Labor movements are in decline, the working day is getting longer instead of shorter, and the conservatives, no longer having the threat of a powerful alternative, don't need the liberals anymore. And so they can be much more naked about not caring about people. Racism is becoming more respectable in the United States and in Europe. So these are clearly hard times. Expectations have been thwarted, and people really don't know what to do in this period. Now, faced with that, some give up. And they decide that you really can't have a much better world. What you can do is perhaps take a little bit of the sting out of this one. And therefore they contract their goals and say, if we can't protect the environment, we might be able to at least protect a few parks. If we can't have real equality, we could at least open up a few more jobs and so forth. There's that kind of giving up and focusing on the small, saying that the project for a really thoroughly distinct, better kind of world is impossible. There are others who decide not only that it's impossible, but that it really wouldn't work, that it couldn't be good. And they take the history of a lot of the barbarities created in the name of revolution as evidence that a better society can't be built. Academics are able to retreat into abstraction, and there are a lot of schools which deny that the world is understandable. Since events seem so irrational, they turn that into a philosophy and say that you cannot have any general understanding of the world, that everything is too unique and individual and capricious. And finally, some people simply stop thinking about the world and focus on their own personal lives, their economic survival, their careers, getting ahead, either in a crass kind of way or else in spiritual directions, taking care of their own health, looking for spiritual pathways for meditation. So there are a lot of ways in which people individually have been coping with the changed situation, with the rise of Gingrichism, the rather frightening increases in bigotry, and the seeming unwillingness of people to take up the struggle for a cooperative, humane, just society. Some of this is an artifact. That is, the media gives a great deal of emphasis to the religious right, but they don't mention the religious left. In Russia, they talk about Zhirinovsky and the extreme fascistic nationalist right. They don't talk about workers' oppositions. In the United States, they give very little publicity to the environmental justice movement, to rank-and-file movements within the unions and so forth. And they make it look as if the Republican victory in the last election was a national referendum. In fact, most people didn't vote. The Republican vote was relatively small as a part of the population. And of those who voted for the Republicans, many of them disapprove of their program, are not really willing to cut down on public education and abolish the EPA and throw people off welfare. So to some extent the shift to the right is real, but in another way it's a media artifact, encouraged by the media. It's an attempt to delegitimize the left, to confuse the left. Because of economic hard times, some of the left institutions have folded, so we don't have a physical embodiment in national left newspapers, magazines. There are conferences such as the Socialist Scholars Conference or the Rethinking Marxism Conference. Groups like the New York Marxist School have continued after 20 years. But on a whole, resistance to the present wave is more local, toned down, less visible. So that's the background in which radicals have to think about what they're doing. In thinking what we've been doing, we have to consider two aspects of it. First of all, what is there that's valuable in the radical tradition? What has it really accomplished? And secondly, which things need to be re-examined? I'm going to talk a little bit about the re-examining, because re-examining is not the same as rejecting. There are things that require re-examination, and there are things that hold up. For instance, capitalism is as nasty as Marx ever said it was. Its destruction of nature is continuing the way it was described in Marx's discussion of primitive accumulation. The polarization of rich and poor, the struggle of employers to get more complete control over the labor process, the use of discrimination of various kinds to divide working people. All of that comes through. The growth of monopoly, the subordination of governments to corporations, which becomes increasingly crass. Even 10 or 15 years ago, they used to talk about a partnership of management, labor, and government. Now labor has disappeared, and you talk about government and the private sector. But the private sector doesn't mean people in their grassroots organizations. It means the large corporations. When that happens, what privatization means is that a lot of the decisions which were nominally decided by one person, one vote in the public sphere are now decided by $1 million, one vote in the corporate sphere. That is, the voting is done on Wall Street, and it seems to be taken as natural. In the health self literature, where they talk about people being under personal stress, one of the examples they constantly use is failing to get that promotion or having a conflict with your boss. So therefore, the highest good is finding out how to cope with a power over which you have no control. It's recognized that the corporate world is running things, and this is taken as natural, acceptable, and without outrage. So against that background, there's clearly a need for a radical opposition. At the same time, we have to recognize that the radical opposition has to change in a number of ways. It has to develop themes which were latent in the socialist movement, which were there. You can find them in the writings of Marx and Engels and so forth. But they were really subordinate themes. For example, the understanding of the position of women in society, the recognition that work in the household is work, and that the productive activity of society takes place both in the marketplace, in the political economy, and in the domestic habitat. There, a lot of what women do is described as consumption. We talk about consumerism, but in fact it's production work. It's the finishing process, just like putting the glaze on the cars. It's doing the last stages in the preparation of food, the last stages in maintaining a structure of the household, the last stages in the cleaning and mending of clothing, and so on. So that's one area. That is, that the radical movement has to assimilate the lessons of feminism. Doing so does not mean abandoning the worldview of radical socialist Marxist perspective. And in fact, Marxism is developed and gained by bringing together of trends such as British political economy, French utopian socialism, German classical philosophy. Now it has to be enriched through the lessons of the radical feminism, particularly the feminism of third world women who are challenging the upper class feminism that sees women's rights as getting more women into the boardrooms. It has to pick up the environmental cause fully, recognizing that environmental issues are not a diversion from our political struggle, but that capitalism is threatening the existence of the species, and that the defense of the environment is the defense of humanity. So picking up on the lessons of the feminist movement and the environmental movement is an important part of the enrichment of radicalism. A third direction is the re-examination of the problem of democracy. Now, as radicals, we have always been very critical of capitalist democracy. First of all, because at its best, it's limited to political democracy, but most of the major decisions affecting people's lives are not in the public domain. The decisions of employers as to what to invest in, where to invest, how to deal with labor, and so on, are simply not something that comes up for election. There are those limitations on democracy. It was recognized that everybody can equally run for president as long as you have your $1 million war chest. That the privatization of entertainment means that it's those with the bucks who determine what's presented on the media. Looking for private support for research to replace public support that's dwindling means allowing the corporations to set the research agenda and so forth. So on the one hand, we've recognized that democracy is limited. We've also seen that democracy increasingly has become an investment. There's a business of managing elections, both at home and internationally. And people have double books on that, therefore. They see on the one hand that elections are the height of democracy, and on the other recognize that elections are commodities run by public relations firms, and that the positions of candidates are calibrated according to polls. Because of this, some currents in the socialist tradition have simply been dismissive of issues of democracy and talked only about economic democracy, equal access to resources for health care, for education, for cultural access. That's very important. That's a way in which the socialist perspective on democracy is deeper and richer. However, it also has to assimilate the importance of political democracy, because only with a political democratic structure can we mobilize the collective intelligence of a people to solve the really difficult problems of how to organize society in a just and humane way. And that's something that has to be taken up, looking very critically at the bad experiences of the past. Now, in looking at those experiences, some radicals have not come to terms with it. There are those who simply reject the radical tradition completely because a lot of nasty things happened. Pol Pot, the Stalin purges, Cayetano's murder of Ana Maria in Nicaragua. There are others who instead make it something alien to our tradition. Clearly, these people were not good revolutionaries. They were not behaving in a Marxist way. The party was not following the rules. And by doing that, they can say that that's not our problem. We would do things right. However, that's not true. And so the way I try to look at that is to look at, let's say, a disease of sugarcane. The rust of sugarcane is not sugarcane. It's a disease of sugarcane. In a sense, it's a distortion of sugarcane. But on the other hand, it's a disease of sugarcane, not a disease of tomatoes or of cattle. So there's a certain sense in which a movement which is vulnerable to particular kinds of diseases and distortions is responsible for them, even though they're a negation of the spirit of that movement. And it's this contradictory way in which we have to look at the radical past. Certainly, until we can guarantee that we're not going to allow it to repeat itself, there is no reason why people should trust the programs of radical and revolutionary parties. There's no reason why radicals should commit themselves with the same intensity of commitment and devotion that they've done in the past. So coming to terms with that past is extremely important, and I think the way to do that is through Rosa Luxemburg's observation that we're trying to build a future with the materials of the past. And that creates particular problems, the problems of corruption under socialism, the problems of grassroots democracy. These are some of the issues that I think a radical movement has to take up in building for a future. But certainly the kind of flaccid retreat into 18th century Adam Smithian free enterprise economy is not an answer to 19th century socialism. And it's very superficial to claim that something is inadequate, that socialist theory is inadequate because it was European, or because it was male, or because it was 19th century. We have to remember that all ideas in the world are foreign ideas in most places, and that in any one place, most of the ideas that people entertain are of foreign origin. So we can look around at the histories of other movements. We can ask, why are there still Christians? After 2,000 years of anti-Semitism, after the Crusades, after the Inquisition, after the complicity of the German churches with fascism, of the union-busting role of some churches, the alliance of the cross and the sword in the conquest of the Americas. And we have to recognize then, not with the facile kind of euphoric optimism of going from triumph to triumph, but with more of a sense of the contradictoriness of the world. We have to come to terms with our past in order to guarantee that it doesn't repeat, and develop fully the potential of the critique of capitalism, which is basically valid, the critique of injustice, the critique of racism, which is a very rich part of the radical tradition, a tradition that led the way in challenging racism in America. I remember that a friend of mine in 1934 addressed the first integrated rally in Montgomery, Alabama, on a May Day celebration under the auspices of the Communist Party. So for all the criticisms and all the failures of radicalism, for all the things that in some sense merited the destruction of radical parties and radical governments, I still think that that's the way of hope for humanity.
The mass media has also been reinvestigating the history of radicalism, more recent radicalism, the 1960s. For example, in the New York Times, there's an article with the headline, "An Unlikely Legacy of the 60s, the Violent Right." And in another article called they're rebels without a cause and couldn't care less. They examine several films that involve youth involved in murder, unsafe sex, robbery, drugs, etc. And they attribute these behaviors to the freedom and openness of the 1960s. Could you comment on this?
Yes, first I would like to say that even the term radical right is a lie. There's an attempt to talk about a symmetry between left and right, left extremism, right extremism, and the middle is the comfortable place to be. But in fact, they're fundamentally different. The radical right is not radical in the sense of going for the roots of problems. The radical right is a reaction against the symptoms of an oppressive society. As a leftist, I feel a lot of sympathy with the radical right's criticism of the power of Wall Street and the corporations, the sense of helplessness before the government, the recognition by the radical right that the police, the FBI, the CIA, and so on are oppressive agencies, that the FBI thugs who stormed into Waco participated in the murder of Fred Hampton, the destruction of the Black Panther Party. They're coming to see the oppressiveness of the state, and I have some sympathy for that. Nevertheless, they are not against capitalism and the real basis of power. They worry about the destruction of the family, but don't see capitalism as destroying the family by commoditizing life. They complain about the loss of values, but they don't recognize that these values have gone into the marketplace and have been debased there. They are not even against big government. They tend to be people with a background in the military, the paramilitary, the Green Berets, the FBI, and so forth. And they're very much in favor of the most negative aspects of American history. They're against government where it infringes on the power of business, but they think that they're defending the small farmer against government, or the small entrepreneur. There are small landlords, for instance, who are against rent control because renting out one apartment is an important part of their income. Nevertheless, real estate is controlled by the big corporations, and in their campaigns against rent control, they pretend to stand up for the little people. So it is false to consider that the radical left and the radical right have anything really in common. Secondly, I think they're attributing too much power to the left in talking about are influencing the ideology in that kind of pervasive way. If we were that powerful, what we would have done was delegitimize capitalism, the marketplace, the commoditization of life. So it's false. It's very, very false in that way. Then there's a complaint that there was too much freedom in the left tradition. The freedom that was allowed was very marginal, very limited. It was freedom around lifestyle. It was never freedom to challenge the real power. During the period of the 60s, you had the Kent State Massacre, the Jackson State Massacre, the violence against the Black Panthers, the persecution of many leftists. So it was not a permissive period. It was permissive as long as you engaged in self-destructive actions that didn't harm the power relations. And we have to reject the idea that left and right are in some sense symmetrical. The radical right was also subsidized by government. Groups like the Minutemen, vigilantism, free enterprise, red baiting, and McCarthyism were all part of a general corporate strategy. So the contrast in our life is not between civil society and government, but between the power of corporations as expressed both privately and through government, and a power of people expressed mostly outside of government, but occasionally through government, at least at a local level.
If you don't mind, I'd like to get a bit autobiographical and perhaps put that into a question about current conditions of education. Could you talk about your own process of radicalization or revolutionary education and how that might serve as a lesson to young people today?
Well, I grew up in a radical home. My grandmother had been around the fringes of the social democratic revolutionary movement in Russia before the 1905 revolution. And in America, she was involved in the struggles of the unemployed, the women's councils particularly, the garment strike in New York in the 1930s. My uncle was an unemployed artist who was active in the Communist Party and in the WPA works projects. So I was in a radical home in which several things were taken for granted. First of all, the world is interesting. My grandfather taught me that we should understand history, cosmology, and evolution. And scientific questions were very often table talk. Secondly, that it's taken for granted that the important thing in life is to make a better world. And so there wasn't the kind of conversation which emphasized accumulating goods. We were very contemptuous of that kind of ambition. It was taken for granted. I knew from my earliest memories that when I came of age, I would join a revolutionary movement. And as it happened, I came of age at a time when these revolutionary movements were dissolving because of the Second World War, and I had to look around for them and then join them a little bit later. So my intellectual life was dominated by the Marxist ideas that the world is rich, complex, connected, that it develops through process, sometimes through abrupt change, that things are the way they are because of opposing forces acting on them, that change is both slow and rapid, and that things that are usually treated as separate really fit together. So I could understand my own personal problems by seeing that as they evolved in a social context. The things that we take for granted about daily life, the way we live in families, how often we eat, are things that developed historically. So those are two elements which are a constant theme, and I was always fascinated with scientific questions of complexity. So I've led an intellectual life with one foot in the academic world and one foot outside. The foot outside was important to act as a critique of what I learned in the academic world, but the academic world provided a lot of the detail to enrich my understanding both of nature and humanity.
And what about lessons for young people today? Because society has changed dramatically in the last 50 years.
Well, one important thing is to challenge the assumptions. Now, you're being sold a bill of goods in school. There is so much that your education is silent about or misrepresents. For instance, one of the values which is being taught now, which the radical right wants to teach, is patriotism. Unfortunately, patriotism has largely been captured by the right, so that it's been identified with the most aggressive, militaristic, chauvinistic aspects of American history, and erases the reality that American history has always been a struggle for justice. The Bill of Rights was brought in to amend a constitution which was a rich man's document. Even the rebellion against England listed as one of its grievances in the Declaration of Independence that the British government was preventing them from massacring the Indians and stealing their land. Slavery was an intrinsic part. Now, this is not intended to trash America, because there was a struggle against slavery. There's a tradition of abolitionism, and I'm proud of American history, but of those aspects that get the least representation. The struggles of people for their liberation from slavery, the people who fought against slavery either as Afro-American slaves or as free blacks or as white people in alliance with the abolitionists. The large numbers of people of European origin who cast their fate in with the American Indians, who may have been originally captured by Indians, but when liberated by white expeditionary forces refused to return. Women who recognized they had more freedom with the indigenous peoples. Iroquois democracy, which was a model for European democracy at its best. So I see America as a struggle, and I choose to extract from this and value in that the rich traditions for freedom in the labor movement, the abolitionist movement, the suffrage movement. So to criticize the injustice of America is not to be unpatriotic or to trash America. I'm proud of American iconoclasm, disrespect for authority, the capacity to organize, to challenge oppression. I am angry at the oppressive traditions, the violent traditions, the wellsprings of bigotry that are very alive and well. So love of country does not mean a blanket endorsement for what the rulers have done, but rather an engagement with its history. As an intellectual, I see the young people being plundered, being misrepresented, being programmed for jobs as defined by the corporate employers. I'm very angry at that, and I think that part of personal liberation is understanding that the world is not the way you're being taught, and to find ways of seeing another side, another perspective on American history, on American reality, and even on your own lives. Not to take for granted that the way you're living is the only way to live or the best way to live, but something to think about and something to challenge and look at critically. If we're getting near 12, we may have to stop.
one result of the move to the right and the deterioration of society is an increase in racism in an already racist society, as witnessed in the last year by the book The Bell Curve,
Yes.
which received enormous amounts of media attention. What's your take on the Bell Curve?
It's not really new. In a sense, it's part of a long history of scientific rationalizations for injustice. With the beginning of the abolitionist movement, with the beginning of Quaker criticisms of slavery, you also have the beginning of theories of black inferiority. So with the waves of immigrants from Europe in the 1920s, you have the beginning of intelligence testing and the scientific demonstration that Jews, Southern Europeans, and East Europeans are less intelligent. So in each stage of development of society, scientific witness is being brought in to justify oppression. The Bell Curve is another step in that. Herenstein has been the author of a thesis about meritocracy, who claims that in the United States anybody can get ahead, and therefore that the hierarchy of power and prestige is also a hierarchy of intelligence, wisdom, commitment, discipline, etc. It's just as false. And my take on this is to take as a working hypothesis that all theories are wrong, which promote, justify, or tolerate oppression. I don't always know how they're wrong. They may be wrong in the data that they use, sometimes very fraudulent data, sometimes in the invalid interpretations, sometimes in false applications of real knowledge. But my starting point is that those theories are wrong, and that they are popular in conservative times because they satisfy the economic interests and the desires for feeling good about themselves of the oppressors.
Is there any validity in their correlation between race and IQ? Can we even define what IQ is?
Neither race nor IQ can be well defined. Race is really less real than racism. Our notion of race is a product of racism. At various times in history, the Portuguese have been considered in a separate census category as black. There was a complaint once about how Indians, blacks, and sailors were conspiring to kill the white people in New York in colonial times. The Irish were considered a separate category, and to this day the Irish are a third world people because of the conditions of oppression of Ireland. So race itself is a category which is invented by racism. People are put in that category in order to abuse them. Secondly, IQ, as defined currently, is a measure of success under existing economic conditions. It may or may not be an adequate measure of that success, but that's irrelevant to any real meaning of intelligence as something indicating human worth. Third, there is such tremendous variation within every population, and we know so little about the way in which people's ability to cope with the world is formed, that it's absurd to attribute to heredity any differences that might be observed. Certainly, the statistical inequalities are applying a false measure to an unreal category. Conservatives, no longer having the threat of a powerful alternative, don't need the liberals anymore. And so they can be much more naked about not caring about people. Racism is becoming more respectable in the United States and in Europe. So these are clearly hard times. Expectations have been thwarted, and people really don't know what to do in this period. Now, faced with that, some give up. And they decide that you really can't have a much better world. What you can do is perhaps take a little bit of the sting out of this one. And therefore they contract their goals and say, if we can't protect the environment, we might be able to at least protect a few parks. If we can't have real equality, we could at least open up a few more jobs and so forth. There's that kind of giving up and focusing on the small, saying that the project for a really thoroughly distinct, better kind of world is impossible. There are others who decide not only that it's impossible, but that it really wouldn't work, that it couldn't be good. And they take the history of a lot of the barbarities created in the name of revolution as evidence that a better society can't be built. Academics are able to retreat into abstraction, and there are a lot of schools which deny that the world is understandable. Since events seem so irrational, they turn that into a philosophy and say that you cannot have any general understanding of the world that everything is too unique and individual and capricious. And finally, some people simply stop thinking about the world and focus on their own personal lives, their economic survival, their careers, getting ahead, either in a crass kind of way or else in spiritual directions, taking care of their own health, looking for...
Harvard School of Public Health professor Richard Levins. Charles Dickens wrote a novel called Hard Times, and surely we're living in hard times. I was wondering if you could discuss the challenges that face radicals in these hard times.
Well, there's been a history of about 150 years of radical struggle that built up the labor movement, built up socialist parties in many countries, that came to power in a number of revolutions. And it seemed as if the trajectory for radicals was to go through one struggle after another, but generally in an upward direction, leading toward a better world, leading toward the elimination of capitalism. This first 100 years, 150-year struggle has in many ways been defeated. Labor movements are in decline, the working day is getting longer instead of shorter, and the Republican vote was relatively small as a part of the population, and of those who voted for the Republicans, many of them disapprove of their program, are not really willing to cut down on public education and abolish the EPA and throw people off welfare. So to some extent the shift to the right is real, but in another way it's a media artifact, encouraged by the media. It's an attempt to delegitimize the left, to confuse the left. Because of economic hard times, some of the left institutions have folded, so we don't have a physical embodiment in national left newspapers, magazines. There are conferences such as the Socialist Scholars Conference or the Rethinking Marxism Conference. Groups like the New York Marxist School have continued after 20 years. But on a whole, resistance to the present wave, spiritual pathways for meditation. So there are a lot of ways in which people individually have been coping with the changed situation, with the rise of Gingrichism, the rather frightening increases in bigotry, and the seeming unwillingness of people to take up the struggle for a cooperative, humane, just society. Some of this is an artifact, that is, the media gives a great deal of emphasis to the religious right, but they don't mention the religious left. In Russia, they talk about Zhirinovsky and the extreme fascistic nationalist right. They don't talk about workers' oppositions. In the United States, they give very little publicity to the environmental justice movement, to rank-and-file movements within the unions and so forth. And they make it look as if the Republican victory in the last election was a national referendum. In fact, most people didn't vote.